In this video, we're going to be discussing how turns are played in Treasuarrrr and the general gameplay loop. As is mentioned on the reference cards here, the game is played in turns. Each player will take one turn, and each turn contains 4 phases. The first phase of the turn is quite simple. You will have a number of cards in front of you throughout the game. Some of them are resources, and some of them are cards that stay in play and give you various effects. During your ready phase, you take any of these cards that are activated and you ready them so that they can be activated again. As a general rule in this game, if something is activated, it cannot be activated again. An activation is generally represented by the symbol you can see on this card with a crescent moon. After the ready phase comes the draw phase. The first thing you do in the draw phase is you draw a card from your deck. At this point, you have to make a decision. You can either take one of your cards from your hand and put them into one of your stacks. These stacks are the resources of this game. They will help you to play cards, and so building them can be very important. However, if you don't want to do this, you can draw an additional card. This means that you're going to have to try and manage the size of your hand against the size of your stacks and how you can play your cards. In the play phase, the player can take various actions, and they can take them in any order that they like. The first action is to play a card from their hand. To do this, you activate a stack. The stack has to be of a size greater than or equal to the cost of the card, the cost being the big number in the left, underneath the icon. So for example, this stack here has 5 cards in it, as you can see by hovering over it, and so any of the cards in this hand can be played with it because they all have a cost of 5 or less. There is an additional restriction, which is to play a card, at least one card in this stack has to be of the same faction. So in this case, Hostage Situation is a pirate card, so we can use this stack to play Spend the Booty, which is also a pirate card. When you play a card, you'll resolve its effects, but I will explain that in the next video. The second thing you can do is you can pay a cost to activate one of your upgrades, covers, or something else that you have in play that has some cost. So if we read Dueling Cutlass's first ability, it needs to be activated in order to use this ability, and you have to pay an additional 1. So you have to use one stack of size at least 1. There is no faction requirement here though, you can use any stack for this. When you do this, you'll use the ability in its entirety and then move on. The third action is you can move your character. Naturally, your character will be able to move up to 2 tiles per turn, and you can move very flexibly. You could move 1 tile and then play some cards and then move another tile. This action is just something you can do at any time. This action is something your opponents can react to, but only once you have finished moving. So if I move into this tile, and then I say, I'm done moving for now, I'm going to move on to do other things, other players could react by playing something that targets me in this new position, but they could not have reacted with something that targets me in this position. When you move into the tavern during your play phase, you will score all your artifacts and get victory points. You are not allowed to move into tiles that contain tentacles, other players, or pieces of cover, which can come up on cards. Additionally, when you do move into the tavern, your turn will end after you score, so make sure you've played all the cards you want to play before you move into the tavern. If you've reached the end of your play phase and you've not gone into the tavern, you will start the Kraken phase. Lots of the time the Kraken phase is going to do nothing. The Kraken phase only happens if a player is next to a tentacle at the end of their turn. In that case, we will follow a few basic steps, which are laid out on the rules reference card. The first thing that happens is that you are pushed by the tentacle. It pushes you away. You can decide any tile that is not adjacent to that tentacle, so you're being pushed away from it. So I could be pushed into here, here, or here, and you get pushed into that tile. So let's say that I choose to go into this tile, because it has an artifact in it. What will happen next is that every tentacle on the board will grow towards the center of the board. Tentacles will always grow in a way that tries to get towards these blue tiles. They will always grow towards the center of the board, but there'll be times where they're not allowed to grow into certain tiles where they want to grow. A tile is not allowed to grow into an artifact tile, it's not allowed to grow into a piece of cover, and it's not allowed to grow so that it's adjacent to a player. So if I had instead chosen to be pushed here, this tentacle here would be unable to grow, because both of the tiles that are closer to the tavern are adjacent to me. In that case, the tentacle simply doesn't grow. After tentacles have grown, you draw a Kraken card from the Kraken deck, which I'm going to give a quick shuffle. These cards have usually two effects on them. The first one is usually something beneficial for the player who's drawn it, so in this case I get to move one extra tile. And then you'll have another effect, which will usually be to spawn a tentacle. When you spawn a tentacle, you randomly determine a square on the board. I'm going to do that using 2 dice here. So I've rolled the second segment. I typically start from Merfolk, although you can really do this however you like. And then I roll a 2 on this dice. So the second segment in the second tile would spawn a new tentacle here. And this tentacle will be able to grow in future turns, and will be able to stand by it to draw more Kraken cards, until the board can become extremely cluttered if you aren't careful. Once a Kraken card is finished resolving, it has its own discard pile. When you try to spawn a tentacle, if the tentacle tile that you generate randomly is occupied by a tentacle or a player or a piece of cover or anything that a tentacle would not normally be allowed to move into, the tentacle will move to the next available spot. Tentacles can spawn into tiles that are adjacent to players, even if they couldn't grow into that tile. When tentacles grow enough, they will eventually reach the tavern. Let's just get a few out to represent this. The first time this happens, nothing happens. You've just got a row of tentacles that players can't move through, they'll have to destroy if they want to get through. But when it happens twice, this cuts off a section of the board. This section of the board is then flooded. Every player who is in the section of the board is immediately pushed into the tavern and forced to score all of their artifacts. Players then cannot enter this section of the board from the tavern until these tentacles are destroyed. When a tentacle gets destroyed, the board simply unfloods. It doesn't destroy the other tentacle, but this area becomes available once again. Some cards will allow you to enter the flooded region. If you do and you end your turn in the flooded region, you're going to get flooded as if you were there when it was flooded in the first place, unless you have a card that says otherwise. When this happens, you will always choose the smallest possible region of the board to flood. So in this case, we flood these 2 segments because that floods significantly fewer tiles than flooding these 4 segments. But sometimes it can get pretty close. Tentacles, as I've mentioned, can be destroyed. Any card that deals damage would normally be used to deal damage to your opponents, but can also damage tentacles. Every tentacle has 1 health, and if you destroy a tentacle tile, it will destroy all of the tiles of that tentacle in front of it, but not behind it. You've cut the tentacle up, and it can continue to regrow. If you cut a tentacle at the base, it's just completely removed. I'm going to quickly discuss the scoring system now. This is something that is a little bit up in the air at the moment, but the current system is that when you return to the tavern, if you are holding a number of artifacts, you score a number that is based on the number of artifacts. It does not scale linearly. 1 artifact is worth 1 point, 2 artifacts are worth 3 points, 3 artifacts are worth 6 points, and 4 artifacts are worth 10 points. You only need to get to 15 points to win the game, so if you ever score 5 or more artifacts, you're just going to immediately win the game. But this does not happen often. You can only score when you enter the tavern either of your own volition or being pushed by a tentacle. Other players are not allowed to push you into the tavern with cards that can push players. They can only push you into other tiles. You don't count scoring unless you have at least 1 artifact when you go to the tavern. So if you have a card that says, when you score, do a thing, that will only work if you're scoring at least 1 artifact. If you go to the tavern empty-handed, you're not scoring and you can't do anything with that. That's the end of this video for now. Hopefully that gives a grasp of the basic mechanics. The next video is going to be discussing cards in detail, as well as how you deal damage to other players and the consequences of that.